Welcome everyone to the show. We are talking about carbohydrates, a carnivore-based approach, insulin, and physical and mental health with our very special guest, Dr. Robert Cywes, also known as the Carb Addiction Doc. So welcome to the show.
Thanks very much, Corrie-Beth. I am very pleased to be here. I'm honored to be here. Thank you.
Well, we feel the same. Well, we'll kick it off with some true or false. So the first question, you can answer true, false, or of course, you are welcome to add a caveat. The first question is, what you don't eat is more important than what you do eat.
As I told you before, I speak a fair amount. It depends on where you're coming from. In the addiction world, if you feel deprived of something, it's just a question of time before you have it. If you're an alcoholic, oh, I'm not allowed to have drink, I'm not allowed to have whiskey. It's just a question of time before you do. In the addiction world, you are empowered by your choices. So where I come from, I can have ice cream anytime I want to. I can go right now and buy some ice cream. I have chosen not to have it. But I choose every day. I empower myself by what I am going to eat. So I knew on Sunday night what I was going to eat tonight. And I'm empowered by that choice. So it's not a right or wrong answer. I agree biologically that the only thing an alcoholic should do in terms of drinking is not to drink alcohol. Nobody tells an alcoholic what they should drink. Everybody loves to tell fat people what they should eat, but you're right, they're not eating carbohydrates. If you have a carbohydrate-related disorder, don't eat them. But as a human being every day, I'm empowered by what I am going to do so that it reduces my looking at what I'm not supposed to or allowed to be doing. Does that make sense? That's a long answer, but it's such an important answer in the addiction world.
All right. Well, we're going to rapid fire these, and then let's definitely do a deep dive on all of them. So number 2 is, there is no difference between insulin resistance and insulin suppression.
Completely opposite sides of a bell curve. It's about as polar opposite an approach. They may look the same, but I'll give you, no, I won't go there. But
we are going to come back around. I do want to go to the deep dive. I mean, trust me, she knows that, and our audience knows.
They may look very similar, but that is where people like myself, Ben Bickman, are able to tell the differences. But I think that's a very, very important. So no, they're polar opposite. If you look at a bell curve, one is here, one is here. And that's what people don't understand. Same thing with some people who eat carbohydrates, like myself, end up fat with normal blood sugar. Other people don't gain any weight. We've all got that friend, look at me, I can eat 6 donuts and I gain no weight. But your blood sugar's through the roof. You may be skinny, but you're a diabetic. And I'm much more afraid of that athlete than I am of the slightly overweight or obese athlete, because the guy that's going to have the heart attack or the stroke is the skinny diabetic, not the ultra distance athlete. Let's talk athletes in a little bit.
Well, I think you're going to love this, true or false, and that is true or false. Food has very little impact on mental health.
I would say that's 100% true. It's when you use food as a drug that it affects your mental health.
Ooh, okay.
All right.
I didn't think you were going to say that.
Yeah, very interesting. I can't wait to get a little deeper on that one. All right, then number 4, there are room for carbs on a carnivore-based diet.
Depends.
Okay.
I like it.
It depends on where you are on the journey.
Excellent.
Very fair.
Paul Saladino, if you read his book from 2020, he was a pure carnivore, had issues, and he's migrated toward a carbohydrate-containing diet, which suits him well. But that has to be individualized. Not everybody is Paul.
I love the individualization. But we got 2 more for you. Number 5 is you get blood work done after 3 months on carnivore. Cholesterol goes up. This is a warning sign that a carnivore diet may not be right for that person.
Cholesterol's got nothing to do with your diet. It's got to do with your hormones.
Amen.
Excellent. Well, then number 6, rugby players are tougher than American football players.
Well, I'll not go there. That's 100% true. That is 120% absolutely true.
I love it.
You take a real blood sport, or add helmets and crash helmets and protection and obesity and prima donnaship. You've got football. Rugby players, we beat the crap out of each other on the field, and then we go have a beer in the pub.
I love it. I love it.
Yeah. Sorry, I got to go there.
I love it.
I'm glad you did. So, I mean, how long you were a former rugby player? How long did you play for?
You're never a former rugby player. I'm just a guy that doesn't get on the pitch very often anymore. You die that way. I played from the age of 5 to the age of 37.
Wow.
Yeah.
Quite a career. Sounds like my lacrosse career.
So just love it. Just absolutely love it.
We'd love to dive into your background and how you got to be here. If you could just tell us a bit about how you became a physician that specializes in metabolic disorders.
Yeah, I'm a default doctor, so everything I did was by default. I came to North America from South Africa under strained conditions and had to leave the country for military service reasons, and South Africa was going through a lot of upheaval. And I couldn't stay in the US. I was here illegally for a year, went up to Canada, but while I was getting my papers right, I had to go into the laboratory, and I did work, just absolutely thrilled that I did, on liver transplantation, liver metabolism, and started to gain some insights into the incongruity between what I was being told and what I was taught in medical school versus the reality of what I was seeing in the laboratory. That we used, for example, in the laboratory, our belief was that a transplanted liver didn't work well when it didn't have adequate sugar. So we became very good at supplying sugar to the liver, and we found that the more sugar we supplied to the liver, the worse it functioned, which is polar opposite to what we were led to believe. So that was where my interest in metabolic health came from. And I was fortunate to be in the lab because I was waiting to get my papers before I did clinical work. I became a surgeon. I'm a general surgeon. I'm actually a board certified pediatric surgeon. But during that time in my surgical career in Toronto, I also quit playing rugby. And I went from a fairly lean, never quite lean, but fairly lean, fairly muscular guy to gaining 100 pounds in the course of a year, and developed a lot of insights, again, by default, into addiction, into weight gain, and into how biological dysfunction leads to health issues. So I've got both a personal story to tell as well as a science-based story. I was also trained by Tim Noakes in South Africa, which is just one of the things I'm most thankful for, because he taught me to ask why.
With respect to your weight gain, I mean, what do you think was the driving force between putting on 100 pounds after several years of being an athlete and having control, if you will, over your body composition? I mean, that's quite a jump over the course of 1 year.
Yeah, and I remember at that time, carb loading was the right thing to do. So half my career, I struggled to gain weight. I was the taller. I mean, I went from playing hooker to playing number 8 in rugby, but I always struggled to gain weight to begin with. So I became very accustomed to eating in those days a very high caloric diet, a lot of ice cream, and we'd make these big shakes of tons of eggs, tons of protein and fat, but also tons of sugar to gain weight, because that was the narrative. Ate a lot of sugar prior to playing, but because of our exercise level, and I never played at a super high level. I'm not Anthony Chafee, okay? I'm regular Joe. But I loved the sport more than I was good at it. But we trained a lot, we were physically active, and I know this is the antithesis to what we know now, but the calories in, calories out is a real thing in terms you can manage weight to a certain extent. But then when I quit playing, I didn't change my diet substantially. So I was still eating way more than I could utilize once I quit playing. But I think the biggest override was the emotional loss. I lost my game, I lost my sport, I lost the people I played with. So I lost human connection, I lost physical activity, I lost my passion for life. I became profoundly depressed. All of those things wrapped up from an emotion management perspective, which happens to a lot of athletes when they suddenly quit. And that mental health crash and the ever-present availability of sugar in my life led me to go from, in the equivalent world, drinking heavily to being an alcoholic. I'm not an alcoholic, but you understand what I mean by that. It's just easier to understand that. And it took me a year or so to understand what the issue was. And then, working in a hospital, University of Michigan, where I had free access to Wendy's, which was halfway between my OR and the ER, and we did these trips all the time, 64-ounce Dr. Pepper 3 or 4 times a day as a starter kit, it added to the weight quite readily.
Did you feel, though, that because of what you were, quote, able to get away with as an athlete, that it just didn't dawn on you that continuing to eat in that way wouldn't negatively affect you? Or was it because of, you alluded to earlier, what we were taught early on was that fat was really going to be the issue, if any issue, with respect to decrements in our health and weight gain, and that, sugar, or carbohydrates in general, is not going to be much of an issue at all.
The last person to know that they're an alcoholic is the alcoholic. Intellectually and intuitively, in the cold clear light of day, they know that it's a problem, but in order to drink, in order to roll up your sleeve and shoot heroin, in order to eat, triple-sized Wendy's burger with extra fries and a 64-ounce Dr. Pepper, it's so obvious. You have to work really hard to be fat. So intellectually and consciously, it's very obvious. But one of the things that makes addicts so damn good at what they do is the ability to distort reality. I know I just had a DUI last week, but for this valid reason, I need the shot of whiskey. We distort reality and we minimize, we trivialize, we rationalize. And the battleground in recovery is against that subconscious immediacy. No alcoholic ever considers the hangover. No heroin addict ever thinks about, in the moment, turning blue and dying. And no obese person who's hitting up the carbohydrates thinks about their diabetes, their heart disease, all of those things. So addiction is really focused on the distortion of reality. Think about anybody playing that, that pathetic little game called NFL football. No, I'm being silly about it. But in order to step on a rugby field, in order to step on a football field, you have to completely ignore the fact that you might get injured. And as soon as you start worrying about your injury, and every player will tell you this, coming back from injury, you're more likely to get injured again when you're hesitant.
That makes total sense. So what was your bottom then? I mean, most alcoholics, drug addicts, eventually, if it doesn't kill them, right, if they are blessed enough to come out of it and turn things around, they all hit a bottom. So what was your bottom? What did that look like?
Well, what drives an athlete into the gym the day after they've had the snot kicked out of them on the rugby field? You've got a drive, you've got an inherent side of things. There wasn't a sentinel event for me that said, okay, this is the time to do it. But it dawned on me that I am not that guy. Mm. And so I looked at this as a mountain to climb to get to the other side. And like anybody with addiction, nobody beats an addiction the first time. So you try, you learn from your mistakes, you fail. There's always there's usually a last time. When you quit smoking, there's a last time when you quit, but nobody just quit the first time fully, because it's a learning process and there is a process to change. It requires contemplation, ownership that this is my problem and that I want to change. And then contemplation and preparation for how you're going to do it. And it's a slow, steady change. Anybody can go on a diet and lose weight. And the majority of people that I see, I would say pretty much every obese person, every diabetic is already an expert at failing weight loss programs, because a weight loss program changes why you gained the weight in the first place. But a weight loss program changes what you eat to lose weight, but it doesn't address why you gained the weight in the first place. And ultimately, nobody just drinks alcohol. Nobody just uses heroin, at least the addicts. Nobody just uses cigarettes. You are a smoker. You are a heroin addict. You are a fat guy. You are a diabetic. You are defined by the condition. It defines you at a fundamental level, because that's the way your brain works. And if you remove the drug, but you don't replace it with an alternative form of emotion management, because that's what this is. This isn't a smoking problem. It's a dysfunctional source of emotion management. And unless you find more effective ways of dealing with your emotional needs, that's problematic. And most of my life, I had carbohydrates, I had my friends, I had rugby, I had a variety of different things. And when I stopped playing, I lost everything and I had a singular thing left. And that was part of the challenge. It wasn't I suddenly became a fat person. I became fat by default because I lost everything else that was supportive to emotion management. And over the course of the last 20 years or so, I've had to rebuild those relationships. I've had to find creative arts, my podcast, that kind of thing. I've had to find other forms of physical activity. I've had to establish human connection. I've had to establish spirituality and meditation in my life. I've had to establish a healthy sleep pattern, healthy sexuality. That's called chess, by the way. Those 5 things are the things that are foundational to a healthy person's life in terms of emotion management. Quitting drinking, you have to do by yourself. AA is there to help you to rebuild. And that's kind of how we see this. Again, assuming that you have an out-of-control relation with the substance. A lot of athletes get into trouble with carbohydrates, not because they have an emotion management problem, but because they have been given the wrong information as a performance enhancement. So each person, are you talking about me right now? But I am not a pro athlete who had a heart attack because they were diabetogenic genetically and they carb loaded their whole life because they thought it would give them a performance advantage. So those people are there by mistake, not because they needed emotion. I've got to understand, as a physician, I've got to understand each one of those people. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So not
It does.
everybody is an addict.
I would love for you to go back to what you said, because I know that your practice specializes in people who have failed at weight loss previously. In your experience, on average, how many attempts do people make before it is their last time?
On average, it's about 3 to 5, but you've got to understand what you're doing. If you just try, I'll give you an example, a perfectly good example. Why does nobody talk about Atkins?
Because he's dead.
No, well, not only he's dead, and he slipped and fell and hurt his head. He didn't die of a heart attack, okay? But no, because I mean, Atkins not as a person, but as a weight loss methodology, because the majority of people that did Atkins did amazingly well. A lot of people lost a ton of weight, but they didn't keep it off because it was a diet. They changed what they were eating, but they didn't replace the role of carbohydrates in their life with something else. A lot of people who successfully quit smoking gain weight because they did a drug transfer from cigarettes to carbohydrates. So we have to understand replacement, not only nutritionally, but also emotionally. And for an athlete, if you're going to go on a carnivore training pattern, you're absolutely going to get a lot worse before you get better. You're going to have a performance failure. And a lot of athletes abandon this because they want to be on all the time. But if you're going to rebuild your body, it takes time. You're going to step back before you step forward. Same thing with addiction. It's a learning process.
What you said about athletes really has resonated with me, because I've been an athlete my whole life. I've heard the same story about carb loading. When we transitioned into, I was a pro natural bodybuilder for several years. Corrie-Beth competed as well. I got her into it. And we used to have a saying, during competition prep, which is carbs for conditioning. And everybody knew you followed the low fat approach, but if you knew how to manipulate carbohydrates, sodium and water, I mean, you could walk out on stage that day looking your absolute best, even though you were feeling your absolute worst, which is another interesting aspect of all this, because I think athletes especially do experience that as well. I think the lucky thing for us is that when we came out of that world of bodybuilding, we were in a place where when we made our transition over to first keto and then eventually moved back to a more paleo type approach and then finally to carnivore, we weren't competing anymore. So it didn't feel like we had to be concerned with making this transition. And I know I've heard Tim Noakes talk about it as well, that sometimes athletes will give up on this process of becoming fat adapted because of that decrement in performance. And, I think the beautiful part for those listening or those watching this is that if you're not that pro athlete, you have the time that it takes to make that transition. And once you make the transition, I mean, I'm going to speak for both of us when I say that we've never felt better. We've never felt more energetic. We've never felt like we've had a better relationship with food, because there's that addictive aspect of it has now disappeared, as well as not being concerned with the performance component as well.
You're exactly right. And, it takes time to transition your body. The story that I give to so many people. So if you're going to change, so let's put it this way. What you said earlier on is you said that on a low fat, high protein, high carbohydrate diet, you can perform extremely well at a very high level. And plenty of athletes have, but there's a ceiling. And if you're a competitive athlete, you're always trying to break through that ceiling. How do I go sub 2 on a marathon? You're concerned about the immediacy. And it's very, very difficult to think, okay, I'm in a little rowboat here. My ship sank, but I'm in a little rowboat. There's a rescue boat 100 yards off. But in order to get to it, I have to get out of my safe haven rowboat where I'm doing just fine and get in the water where I may not survive to get to safety on the other side. And it's that predicament that affects a lot of athletes. I have to go backwards to go forward. But if you're concerned about that ceiling, or you're worried about, my friend was found floating in the water after a triathlon. Tim Noakes' closest female friend, one of his close female friends, died at the finish line of waterlogging. He's written a book about that. Okay, she collapsed and died because she was on a high carbohydrate diet, drinking a lot of water and not getting enough electrolytes in, and collapsed and died because of brain swelling. He wrote a book about that. That's where he came after Gatorade. So that changes our personal narrative. But just from a performance ceiling perspective, that's an issue. At the same time, we've got to understand that we've got to have a long vision. Think about this. Think about the NFL athlete or the rugby player. And I did this for many, many years with a lot of colleagues. They come off, they've just had a massive concussion. They come off, they shake it off, and all they want to do is get back on the field. They don't care about what their brain is going to look like next year or 5. All they know is right now, I want to get out there and compete. And I'm not willing to take a rest for my brain for long term. So when we talk about all the long-term damage, every athlete thinks they've got a big S on their chest. They wear their underwear on the outside. They are Superman in the moment or Supergirl in the moment. And what they're looking to do is to get out there and perform. So to take that break to be able to transform. But if you just got beaten, if you just didn't make it out of the pool, the first rounds of a Rugby World Cup, now maybe you're going to take your team and transition it. If you didn't make it to the finals, if you failed in the elimination rounds, now you've got to look at something better. But if you're a top athlete, you're not going to change anything because you're the top athlete. Does that make sense?
No, that makes perfect sense. And I mean, which is also why you sometimes hear that argument. I'm gonna talk about it on the bodybuilding side. You'd always hear the argument, well, all the best competitors, this is what they're doing. And we were all following poor advice, but there are those genetic outliers that in spite of what they do, they're always going to get a massive result. And just like that athlete who, in spite of what he or she does, is still going to be the best athlete with or without the ideal diet. And it's only those that typically fall in that mid-range who are striving to become the best, who have that willingness to take that step forward and do something different because what they've been doing hasn't been working. So yeah, I love the example. I would love to just go back to the original question that we had asked about, and it was funny because you gave a great answer around it, which had to do with, what you don't eat is more important than what you do eat. And you said really it depends on the individual. So I'd love for you to unpack that a little bit more.
Yeah, so the challenge with addiction is not feeling deprived. You're going to be successful at combating your addiction if you don't feel deprived of alcohol, but you're empowered by the fact that I didn't drink. So in the moment, you may miss the alcohol a little bit, but tomorrow morning you wake up sober and your head's clear. You feel pretty empowered that I didn't get into trouble. If you are a runner and you bonk at a certain distance, and then you're slowly converting to burning fat, and you hit that mile, and I've got a particular mile where I know I'm going to crash and bonk, and you don't. It feels so good. Or let's say you run a marathon and or an ultra distance run, or you play a game of rugby, and for the next 3 days you're going to be lying in bed or in ice buckets, and the next day you're up and back at the gym, and your recovery is so good. So it's looking for the positive moments that inspire you. And I call it killing your best friend. You didn't become fat because you hate eating carbohydrates. You became fat because you're willing to sacrifice everything in your life to have access to carbohydrates. You don't care. I just need that. So when you find something better, when you are inspired every day, and remember, your best friend's a zombie. She's going to keep coming back after you. You don't eat carbohydrates today. Tomorrow morning you're waking up, you're going to have to kill that passion again, that desire for them again, particularly when life is throwing curveballs at you. So the objective is to be empowered every day by how much better you're feeling, how good, and not every day is a good day, but how much better you are to be able to say no. That's the key, but also being humble enough to recognize the distance is my best friend. Because no matter how empowered I am, if I have proximity, I'm very vulnerable at down times to screwing up. So you really have to remove them from your environment as best you can. It's not always possible, but protecting you from yourself, because the only person that relapses is you. Nobody comes up to me and ties me up with duct tape and puts a funnel in my mouth and pours ice cream down my throat. So we've got to understand that this is about me and me. And that's where the empowerment comes in. Now, the flip side is, I don't care what you eat. If you're a carb addict, if you're fat or diabetic, or have essential hypertension or metabolic hypertension, PCOS, it doesn't matter what the disease is. The only thing there is your relationship with sugar and starch is broken. Get rid of them. But we often in our space shame people that they're not carnivore, shame people that they're eating vegetables, or I don't care what you eat. Nobody tells an alcoholic what they should drink, as long as it's not carbohydrates. And oh, but the oxalates, oh, but the seed oils. Well, if you're not eating carbohydrates, you're just not getting enough. There's no way you can really get a lot of seed oils in.
It's true.
And the bizarre part is seed oils are essential to the human being. You cannot live without seed oils or without 6 omega fatty acids, which are what seed oils are. You have to have them in exactly a 1-to-1 to a 1-to-3 ratio, ideally with threes. Everybody focuses on the 3 omega fatty acids, but our space is wonderful, but it sometimes distorts reality.
Well, and a lot of that too is because of the fact that, you know, when people are demonizing seed oils, which we've had a lot of great guests on here, you know, like Chris Kenobi, right? Very, very intelligent, understands, does a tremendous amount of research around seed oils. At the end of the day, it comes down to the ratios and the percentages, right? We are just consuming them in excess, and we never had access to this much all at one time until the introduction of the seed oils, all the vegetable oils. And so it was never really an issue. But yes, of course, like the polyunsaturated fats are in the meat that we eat, right?
But you see, what you asked me earlier on is are we empowered or are we deprived? You know, in other words, is it about what you're giving up or is it what you're doing? So I never consider seed oils because they don't exist in the food I eat. I never have to worry about them. They just don't exist in the food. Well, they don't exist intentionally in the food I eat. The reality is every steak I eat, the dominant fat in my steak, if I'm eating a ribeye steak, is actually polyunsaturated fatty acids. By percentage, it's the highest percent. So there's a distortion of reality there. But let's take something else. Oh, I've got celiac disease. I've got gluten. I don't care about gluten. Why? Because if you're not eating carbohydrates, you don't eat gluten, period. So it's an irrelevant thing. But if you want to be gluten-free and you're eating cardboard because you don't want to eat bread, that's problematic for me. So many of these things are just defaults that if I'm not eating carbohydrates, automatically what I am eating is decent for me. It's not going to cause me massive harm, depending a little bit on who you are. And then we can optimize diet from a performance and from a health perspective. But the reality is get rid of the addiction first. If you're an addict, if you're an athlete, okay, let's talk about optimizing your diet. And it depending on who the athlete is and what you're doing. So, for example, that burst athlete, the sprinter, they may be okay performance-wise with carbohydrates if they don't care what their life looks like at 50, 60, and 70. And most burst athletes are in their teens, at most in their 30s, by the time they hang up their cleats or their gloves or whatever it is. So if they're focused on that performance, I don't have a problem with carbohydrates, but then when you quit, change. You know, if you're a boxer and you don't want to go 15 rounds, but you're going to go 1 or 2 rounds, carbs are great. Mm-hmm. But if you're going to go to 14, 15 rounds or 10 rounds, that's a problem. Mm-hmm. If you're a 100-meter athlete or a sub 400 athlete, 400 and lower, but if you start getting into the 1800, into the 800, 1500s, that's maybe where you may want to think a little bit differently.
Yeah, it's so interesting. You say something and I'm like, I don't know if I agree, but then you unpack it and I'm like, oh my gosh, I totally agree. I really love how individualized your approach is. So my question is, you know, outside of athletes, just the regular person eating a standard American diet, what would be, and I know we can't give a general recommendation, but what would be one of the first or second things you would do to help that person overcome their carb or sugar addiction?
So first of all, a standard American diet is not a healthy diet, period. Okay, and I think it's not healthy for anybody, addiction or otherwise. It is not a healthy diet, period. Okay, so the first thing you want to recognize, or you want to have a conversation with yourself, is: do I want to change? Do I care? And there are plenty of people that say, look, I kind of care, but this way of life for me is wonderful. It just doesn't matter to me right now. So you reach a point where the benefit, the ease, the pleasure, because we're surrounded by it. In this country, you have to go out of your way to be healthy. Okay, the default is being unhealthy. It's just the reality. Okay. I mean, in California, people get in their car to drive next door to go visit their parents. We don't walk. So again, I'm bashing California because I live in Florida. Like, we're a lot better. But the point is that by default, our default lifestyle here is extremely unhealthy. We work too hard. We don't play enough. We think about everybody else. We get stressed out about everybody. We don't have relaxation. We don't have gratitude. Again, generalizing. So when it comes to the diet, you've got to make a decision that you want to change as an individual, because society is against you. Industry is against you. The government is against you. Everybody has an incentive that is not in favor of your better health. The entire incentive of our entire society is to steal your best health from you to support financial and political gains. And I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but that's just the reality. The healthcare system is engaged in making money, not in making people healthier. That's
Couldn't
why we
agree more. I say
Right.
I'm not a theorist, I'm a conformist. So you just confirmed everything I believe.
Yeah. So you have to choose as an individual that you want to be healthy. So for example, with my practice, I don't go out and say to people, hey, come in, I can help you. People call me up and say, hey, I want you to give me guidance as to what I need to do. Because remember that I can do nothing for anybody. I'm not going to come over to your house and put food in your face or slap it out of your face. I'm going to give you guidance, but when it comes to your own health, the only person that can do it is you. There is no medication that you can outsource to. There are medications and surgeries that can help you along the way, but they cannot do it for you. And they are transitional. They are not long-term, because this is a behavioral problem. So once you decide you want to change, you want to roll up your sleeves and start to put the hard work in, knowing, as we talked about earlier on, you're going to suck at it. You're going to be terrible at this to begin with. But slowly over time, you learn from your mistakes, you analyze them, you make corrections, you get better and better and better. But there is never an end point. The end point happens after you die. There's never perfect health. Perfect health happened when the sperm and the ovum met. Okay, that's the only perfect health, is when those two come together. That's the most perfect you're ever going to be. So just along those lines, most people try to live longer. Oh, I want to be healthy so I can live longer. Okay, this isn't about living longer. This is about not shortening how long you were supposed to live for. Big
That's really
difference.
good.
Okay. And a lot of people advertise live longer stuff. Oh, take this product, do this, take this, you're going to live longer. I just don't want to subtract from my life. I want to minimize my subtraction. Okay. So I'll give you an example of that. I talk about this a lot. Everybody knows you shouldn't text while you're driving, because you can suddenly shorten your life. Okay. But if you don't text while you're driving, you're not going to live longer. You're just not going to die shorter. Okay. There is no living longer unless we do genetic rearrangement, but we subtract from that. So that's the choice you make as an individual. And you ask me, how do we start? Ownership. I want to do this. I know that I'm going to struggle. I know that I need to roll up my sleeves and put the work in. And I'm going to be a tortoise, not a rabbit. All too often, I get people coming in wanting to be a rabbit, or they tell me how wonderfully they've done. I've been carnivore for 2 months. I don't care. And I don't mean that in a nasty way. I care about where you are at 5 years, at 10 years, at 20 years. I care about what you put in your suitcase in December. Okay, what do I mean by that? I care about you putting a Bible or your track shoes or your guitar in your suitcase, not snacks or alcohol or cigarettes. We pack our suitcase by the dominant thing that we do.
Can you walk us through that? I thought that was such a beautiful thing when Dr. Anthony Chafee interviewed you about your suitcase and how that defines us.
Well, every human being has a dominant source of emotion management. You see, I talk a lot with my hands. That's an anxiolytic for me, so that I can focus on what I'm saying. But everybody has a quirk. And the quirk defines who we are, because we are defined by the dominant thing that we do throughout the day for emotion management. And we can transform that. So, the smoker in their suitcase when they go away is going to pack cigarettes. The alcoholic is going to pack some whiskey. The churchy person is going to pack a Bible. The athlete's going to pack their yoga pants and their running shoes. The musician's going to pack the guitar. A large part of the transformational process in our practice, you ask me, what do we do? It's changing that narrative. You know, how many times do you get on a plane for a 4-hour plane ride and you see all the fat people with all the snacks they've packed in case, and I'm going to be nasty here, they're going to die of anorexia on the plane ride. Because it's not about eating, it's about emotional restitution. So a large part of our practice is to transform where you go for emotion management. This for me is coffee. When I was fat, this was a Coke and M&Ms. It's a forced transformation. And as you can see, this is well used, okay?
For a guy, hold on, for a guy who went to Ohio State, I'm pretty shocked to see the
I was at Ohio State this long. For the rest, I bleed maize and blue. Okay, and I know it's a tough one. It's a tough one, but my first university in the U.S. was Ohio State. Then I went up to Toronto, and then I ended up in Michigan. And Tom Brady will always be my guy. He and I were there at the same time. Never knew him there, but yeah, we were there. I was there in '97 when they shared the cup. But the point I'm making is that that's our introduction. You really have to shift away from this being primarily a nutrition problem to more being a substance abuse problem. Then the longevity is there. You can cut out calories. You can go on any diet. You can go on the cookie diet and lose weight, but you're not going to sustain it. So as we get into this with our patients, I really try to work really hard, at least for my people with a metabolic disease, as opposed to the athletes trying to be better. I want to talk about the athletes in a little bit, but those folks have a liability. Their way of emotion management has created a liability. And the liability defines the depth of the liability defines the addiction. Addiction is not just drinking coffee. I drink a lot of coffee. It causes me no harm. But if I'm 300 pounds and diabetic or whatever it may be, that measurable harm defines the word addiction. Overuse, use and overuse, even abuse is not addiction. It's predicated by harm. So one DUI, you know what? I might have made a mistake. 5 DUIs and liver disease, you're an alcoholic, whether you think that or not. So we have to convert people away from weight loss and caloric restriction to thinking of this as a mental health problem. Then we've got to slowly adapt the diet. You don't have to stop eating carbohydrates. In fact, I would tell you, it's a bad idea to stop eating carbohydrates in one day. You slowly make that transition. Okay, I'm going to start drinking coffee instead of Coke. I'm going to get rid of the rice for a little while. Then I'm going to add the potatoes. Then I'm going to increase maybe the amount of meat I'm eating relative to carbohydrates. I'm not going to buy fruit anymore. You slowly make those changes, and it's a stepwise, tortoise-like transition. If you say, tomorrow I'm going to go carnivore, I'll see you in 3 weeks, 3 months, 6 months, okay? Because if you take 100 years and you subtract your current age, that's how long this has to last for. And that's a long time. I mean, no matter how old you are, that's a long time. So that's the transformation, that it's changing your entire behavior system. It's changing who you are as a human being. You can't break a habit if you're still doing it. And you can't create a new habit if you don't do it regularly. And that's also an important, I'm going to have a cheat day. That's a relapse.
Yeah.
Okay. Because you're keeping the thought alive. Okay. If you had a relationship with an abusive spouse, how often do you want to go back to them? Some people do, but that's my relationship with carbohydrates. It's a struggle, but it's a winning struggle. But that's the addiction side. On the athletic side, you really are trying to convert the engine of their body to burning fat, not sugar. And that also takes a very long time. It can take months to even a year or two to fully fat adapt, where the cells of your body prefer to burn fat, of which you have an endless supply, no matter how lean you are, whereas you've got a very finite supply of sugar. So the athletes do much, much better. And remember, what defines a good athlete?
I'm going to say their performance.
No, wrong. What defines a good athlete is training and preparation. There are very, very few athletes that never train, never practice, never prepare, and get out there and just do it at a high level. So the best diet is the one that prepares you for your best performance.
That makes sense. That makes total sense.
So that, failing to prepare is preparing to fail. It's a little saying that I have. And a ketogenic diet, number one, helps you to train better, longer, more intensely, and reduces your downtime where you have to rest. You still have to rest, but it reduces or it improves your recovery. Whether you injure yourself or whether you're just recovering from intense performance, intense training, it reduces that recovery.
Is that because of the reduced inflammation that they're experiencing because of now not having these inflammatory foods in their diet?
Well, two things. Yes, definitely it reduces inflammation. So you're not running in an inflamed state. But the second thing is whenever you're performing at a high level, no matter what the sport is, unless it's a vigorous game of chess, you are creating injury to your body. You're injuring muscle, you're injuring certain things. And so your ability to repair that tissue is very, very important through this process. My job, by the way, my job is not to be right or wrong. My job is to make you think.
Yeah,
Mhm.
I love that.
Yeah.
I love that.
Decide for yourself, am I right or wrong as it pertains to you? But the point about a ketogenic diet for an athlete during training or even after a performance is you have to repair your tissue because you damage your tissue on any, I mean, you think about playing rugby or sprinting or whatever it is, you're tearing up muscle, you're tearing up tissue. And the being insulin sensitive, which is really what we're talking about, insulin is your anabolic hormone. And if insulin is not working properly, you can't repair your tissue as well. So when insulin, thyroid hormone, human growth hormone, testosterone are all working together as your anabolic set of hormones, you can repair your tissue very quickly. Your ligaments, your muscles, your joints, your interstitial space, all of those tissues get repaired much, much more quickly. So not only do you diminish injury by reduced inflammation or the risk of injury, you are able to repair that tissue much more quickly. And along those lines, let me look at the football example. If you look at a wide receiver versus an offensive lineman, what's the difference?
Oh, I mean, their body types are completely different.
Why? What's different about them?
One is usually lean, muscular with a very low amount of body fat, and the other one is rotund, will also have a large amount of muscle mass, but also carries a lot of fat mass.
And what injuries do each of them get? Because the injuries are very different.
They are very different. Receivers are more likely to probably blow an ACL, issues with ankles.
But they're going to pull a hammy, they're going to do a ligament or a tendon injury that is not necessarily caused by contact. Whereas the lineman is going to hurt their ankles, their knees, their hips, usually because of contact. They're going to get their knees crushed or whatever it is, rolled up on. They have contact injuries, whereas the wide receivers often have self-induced injuries. Okay. What's the difference?
He's got to answer. I don't know football.
No, I mean, you can tell the difference between them is this, that the lineman is more obesogenic. Let's assume they eat exactly the same diet, and the diet's not that different, but the lineman is going to turn all of that, what they're eating, into muscle and into fat. The wide receiver is going to turn that into energy, but with high blood sugar levels. So they're going to be more typically, this is not everybody, but typically more obesogenic, whereas the lineman is going to be more obesogenic. And the diseases and the damage and the injury they get is very different. I'll give you another example as to this. When you look at cows, okay, if you take two completely opposite types of cows, they all eat grass. You put them out in the pasture, they're all eating exactly the same amount of grass. Some of those cows become big, muscular Angus bulls. Others come back and they're bony and lean, but they've got this udder full of milk. So some have processed that to energy, which is the milk. Some have processed it to muscle. So we've got to look at people as individuals, because that's what carbohydrate loading will do to those two athletes. Does that make sense?
But no, that makes a lot of sense, and it speaks a lot to the genetic factors, correct? Right. I mean, that's ultimately what we're talking about here, is how the body is utilizing, the hormones that it's producing, or how the hormones we're producing is utilizing the food that we're consuming.
Right, but now let's take those same two athletes who have carb loaded. The one guy's this big fat lineman who has to go and suck oxygen between plays and can only play 2 downs instead of 4. And the guy that's tearing his hammies or tearing his shoulder and getting all of the ligament and joint injuries. And let's put them on a ketogenic diet. That lineman is going to be enormous, but not fat. Okay? He may still get his knee rolled up. There's still injuries. But he's going to be a little bit more like one of the Kelsey brothers, rather than, some big fat lineman that is just that just occupies space on the line. The wide receiver is going to be faster, more flexible, and less afraid to make a hard stop and turn because he knows that his joints, his ligaments are going to be fine.
Mm-hmm.
So becoming, flipping to a carnivore, not to a carnivore, but to a ketogenic way of life improves your confidence in your own athletic performance.
Mm-hmm. No, it
And
makes
again,
a lot of sense.
That's just a very, very simple answer to that. You know, if you bring those same two cows into a feedlot and you give them grain, the Angus beef is going to be much more marbled, much more fatty, and the cow is going to produce more milk but poorer quality.
So I think this would be a great place, because since we've already been touching on it a little bit more with respect to this conversation around insulin. I mean,
Yeah.
that is the focal point, I believe, of most of your work and what you talk about with patients that you're dealing with. So let's just unpack that a little bit more. I mean, I think most people here are very well aware of insulin resistance and what causes insulin resistance. And it is the high carbohydrate processed food type diets, right? So we know that. But what's very interesting is what I've heard you speak about, which is insulin suppression. And that is on the side that, let's say, the three of us are on, where we eat predominantly carnivore, at least a very, very, very low carbohydrate diet. There are still people who have, quote, insulin issues, which for all intents and purposes seems strange when carbohydrates are not present.
Right. And I think it's a very important, again, it's a bell curve. So most people in this country are insulin resistant. The ideal is to be insulin sensitive, but if you push it too far across that bell curve, you can become resistant to insulin. So let's start at the beginning. You mentioned that I'm very into insulin. I'm not. Insulin is a byproduct of what I do. What's the most dominant hormone? What's the most dominant hormone in healthy metabolism?
Glucagon?
Glucagon. Okay, so energy supply should be based on demand, not on having to deal with excess. And because for the first time as a species, probably with little blips, but this is the worst scenario of abundance that we live in. In America, we no longer have a lack of food for most people. We have an abundance, too much, a tsunami of stuff. So we're having to deal with excess rather than a deficiency. But the ideal healthy state is where the cells demand a source of energy, a source of nutrients, and hormonally the liver supplies it. And under those conditions, glucagon is the dominant hormone. Insulin is a byproduct that for certain cells, the muscles being the most common, insulin facilitates the introduction of low levels of sugar across a membrane into the cells. In insulin resistance, insulin is desperately trying to clear the excess sugar from the bloodstream because there's this massive load of sugar in the bloodstream based on what you're eating and drinking. So the way the cells defend them is they develop what's called insulin resistance. They block the receptor so that insulin can't get the sugar into the cells. And then there's one of two scenarios. One is where you produce more insulin to keep shoving that in. That's the obesogenic scenario. And then the other one, the diabesogenic scenario, is where the resistance is greater than insulin production and the blood sugar builds up. Each has their own set of injuries, okay? But insulin is not a primary sugar controlling hormone. Glucagon is, as you so well said. We associated insulin with that because it was discovered as a hormone in diabetics who have a sugar processing issue because they can't produce insulin. So we've created that association, just like we use estrogen as a female hormone. But I've got lots of estrogen in me. I'm not, as far as I last looked, I'm not a female. But estrogen has many other functions outside of the gynecologic ones. Insulin has the majority of functions that insulin has are not associated with energy provision. They're not associated, certainly not with glucose. That's a minor role that they play, and a lot of cells don't need insulin to work. So, but insulin has all these other functions that are crucially important, okay? One of the initial theories that we had was that insulin is released, and this is what I was taught, that insulin is released in response to blood sugar. But that's false, okay? That is false. And intuitively, it has to be false because by the time your blood sugar is elevated, it's too late if you're a healthy person. Mm-hmm. So you want a warning system that says, hey, insulin, get ready, there's sugar coming in. And the only place we really should be getting sugar in is in our gut. We eat it, okay? Because 1,000 years ago, we didn't have intravenous sugar, we didn't have other forms of sugar. So when sugar gets into the gut, there are sensors in the gut that measure our sugar level, our glucose level, and there are hormones in the gut, the most dominant one being GLP-1, which is, everybody knows because it's Ozempic, that's what it does, and it triggers the release of insulin, blocks glucagon, okay? So insulin gets released in response to GLP-1, not in response to blood sugar. So I can take a patient to the hospital and inject insulin, inject glucose into their vessels, and they don't get they get a little blip, but not a significant insulin response. If they eat the same amount of sugar, they usually get a big insulin response, okay? Now, what does glucagon do? So if you eat no carbohydrates, you're not getting that GLP-1 response. GLP-1 is nice and quiet. You're metabolically healthy, your acid reflux goes away, your irritable bowel syndrome goes away. Those are all triggered by GLP-1 that says, hey, there's too much coming in. It's trying to protect you from too much. That's why we get queasy on Ozempic. Not because Ozempic's the problem, it's because you're eating carbohydrates, okay? So all the symptoms that are attributed to GLP-1s, oh, Ozempic's bad because it causes gastro. No, it's trying to protect you from overeating. It's doing its job. But if you're eating carnivore on Ozempic, you do great. Again, if you're eating carnivore, you don't need Ozempic.
Right.
But the point is that all those things that all the people in our space say, oh, Ozempic's so bad, they're because of your diet, not because of the drug. Anyway, what glucagon does is two things. Glucagon, first and foremost, releases sugar from the liver. The liver always stores sugar. Glucagon releases sugar to the cells in demand for sugar. So when my cells say, dude, I'm running short in a healthy person, it releases sugar to the liver, to the bloodstream. So it supplies sugar usually in the face of a low blood sugar. And then it uses a little bit of insulin to get it in there. Secondly, at meal times, after meals, glucagon creates sugar out of protein. A little bit out of glycerol, which is a part of fat, but it turns protein into sugar. So if you're a carnivore and you're not consuming any sugar, you never, ever have to worry. You don't need to eat sugar because your liver, under the influence of glucagon, is very good at making and storing sugar.
Gluconeogenesis.
Gluconeogenesis, exactly right. And then the third thing it does, it shuts off cholesterol production, which is controlled by insulin, and it triages the same pathway. Think of a railroad with a branch. It's a gate switch, and glucagon triages fat toward ketones in the liver. So the liver, under the influence of glucagon, produces ketones. And every time you go for a long period without eating, you go through two phases. The first phase is the glucose utilization phase, where your body is releasing sugar from the liver, and you're still using sugar, but it comes from production, not consumption. And then once your liver runs out of sugar, you then run on ketones, and you can run on, the most skinny athlete can run on ketones for 5 or 6 days. Okay, think about that. Ian Lake just did a beautiful experiment called a 0-5-100. He's a skinny ultra-distance athlete who ate no calories, and he's a type 1 diabetic, ate no calories for 5 days and ran 20 miles a day and was 100% fine.
Wow.
I just did, at the beginning of March, I did a 0-5-15, which is no calories for 5 days, ran a 5K every day and a 15 on the last day. Fine. I was in deep ketosis, but I was fine. I'm going to do the same next week. So anyway, I mean, that's a side issue. So the point is that that's what glucagon does, okay? Now, glucagon only functions, or in a healthy way, at low levels of insulin. Insulin and glucagon control each other, okay? So if you are not consuming carbohydrates and you are fat adapted, where glucagon is responsible for your energy, then your insulin levels slowly drift down. And if you are eating a massive amount of fat, then you really need very, very little sugar. The largest user of energy is your muscles. And if your muscles divert across or get trained to use fat as a fuel source and ketones, they can survive absolutely fine with almost no sugar. There are a few cells, like your red blood cells, that have to use sugar, but they need it at a very, very low limit, and they don't need insulin. Red blood cells do not need, the liver does not need insulin to take up sugar, okay? Insulin is there for protein production, for cholesterol production, so it has a role in the liver, but the liver does not need insulin to take up sugar. And the liver, by the way, cannot use ketones as a fuel source. Interesting. That's more the Bill Nye, the science guy, kind of nerding out a little bit. But so you can survive absolutely fine with super low levels of insulin in terms of energy provision. You just need a tiny, tiny fraction of insulin for your brain, for a few other organs, but it can go super, super low. Okay. However, when you are so fat adapted by not eating carbohydrates for a protracted period of time that you don't produce any insulin, you then lose the ability to produce insulin. Okay. And we call that a pattern 5 on a Kraft test. So the Kraft test is where you give somebody 75 grams of carbohydrates and you watch what happens over anywhere from 2 to 4 hours. I like a 4 to 5 hour test. You watch their blood sugar go up and down, but you also watch their insulin go up and down to bring the sugar down. Okay. However, in a Kraft 5, when you are insulin suppressed, your blood sugar goes screaming up and your insulin is flat. By definition, it's less than 30 units. So your sugar stays up for a long time and you don't produce insulin. Well, who else does that? Type 1 diabetics who cannot produce insulin. Okay. So people that are fat adapted on a very low carbohydrate don't produce insulin, which is fine for an energy perspective. They're fine. They're in ketosis. I'm lean. I'm an LMHR. I'm fine. But here are the problems. When you don't produce insulin, your absorption of fat and cholesterol from your diet goes through the roof. So all these people with super high LDHs and LDLs and super high cholesterols, that's because insulin production is super low. They're not producing cholesterol in their liver, they're producing ketones. But when insulin is low, high insulin or elevated insulin blocks the absorption of too much fat from the diet, cholesterol from the diet. So when insulin levels are low, all that dietary fat is coming up from the diet, which I don't care about. I don't care how high your LDL and your cholesterol are. Okay, it's not an issue for me. But when your insulin's low, you're not producing protein. What does every athlete want? Healthy protein production. Insulin regulates protein production. Insulin regulates cholesterol production in the brain. Insulin regulates too much sugar. So if the glucagon is releasing too much sugar into the bloodstream, now you've got a rise in blood sugar and you're not clearing it.
It would be beneficial for somebody who is following a carnivore or ketogenic diet to implement some carbohydrates into their diet.
We're getting there. So the other, and this is what Ben Bickman and I, we just had a discussion on my YouTube channel where we discussed, it's a bit of a nerd out, but here's the thing. Insulin blocks fat release from the fat cells. So by definition, when you need fat, you cannot, when your body needs fat as a fuel supply, you cannot have high insulin because it blocks fat release. So here's the key thing. When you then eat lean protein, there is no store in the human body for protein. The only way to store excess protein, or the only two things your body does with protein is that it turns it into takes those amino acids. Gut breaks protein down to amino acids. The liver then rebuilds that as new protein under the influence of insulin. Or under the influence of glucagon, it turns that extra protein into sugar and fat. And the worst thing an athlete, especially a power athlete, a bodybuilder or a weightlifter or whatever, they don't want to divert the protein away from muscle towards sugar. So now what's happening is because there's no insulin, too much glucagon, you got gluconeogenesis, you're turning protein into sugar. The excess sugar is being turned into triglycerides, which you don't want because that raises your blood sugar. And you're seeing these higher A1Cs, you're seeing this rising blood sugar. And in order to facilitate the storage of fat in your fat cells, you cannot have high insulin. So not only are you producing too much triglycerides and too much sugar from protein, you're not building adequate protein because you need insulin to do that. So insulin suppression where I don't need insulin is very, very harmful, both metabolically. Insulin is also there for cancer surveillance, for a variety of other things. So you're defeating the purpose of being healthy if you are trying to be too healthy and become so fat adapted that you're not releasing insulin. So what releases insulin? Okay, and we thought initially that it was blood sugar. So about 5 or 6 years ago, maybe a little bit longer, I did an experiment in this group of patients. We took over 1,000 fat-adapted carnivores. And there were a couple of people in our space that said, oh, this is such a good thing. Give them lean protein. And we know lean protein becomes sugar. So we said, let's feed them lean protein. Let's cut the fat out. And they ate lean protein and they felt miserable, miserable. They were hungry all the time. They were miserable. They were weak. They were flat. And they all started eating fat again. Why were they miserable? The only two people that I know that do well on a high protein, low fat diet are Ted Naiman and Maria Emmerich. But 100% of our lean experiment failed. And that's how we know that, because their blood sugar went up, but they didn't release insulin. That is how that was the penny drop for me, that it's not blood sugar that raises insulin, maybe a little bit. But if your blood sugar goes up, you don't have access to fat and you're living on fat. So Ben Bickman and I are both completely in consensus that lean protein to create sugar in your body does not trigger insulin release. Only GLP-1 and gut sugar triggers insulin release. So long story short, to answer your question, the first step for performance is to become a fat-utilizing, fat-adapted athlete. And then based on the blood work, we can slightly bring you back by introducing some carbohydrates, either in the form of some dairy or either long-acting like a potato or a UCAN for some of the ultra-distance athletes. But the purpose of the sugar is never as a fuel source. The purpose of the sugar in your diet is to trigger GLP-1, to trigger insulin.
That's fascinating. So one more question on that. With Ozempic then, if Ozempic is a GLP-1 blocker, how does that then play into this conversation?
So GLP-1 is not a fat blocker. GLP-1 triggers insulin and blocks glucagon.
Okay.
So it reverses that. It allows you to use more sugar if you're insulin resistant. So it makes insulin more effective. Okay.
Understood.
And it also, you see, the paradox in insulin resistance is there's a lot of sugar in your bloodstream, but because of the insulin resistance, your cells have a low blood sugar or low cellular sugar level. So it's too high here and too low here. So the cells are saying to the liver, dude, I need sugar, I need energy. Okay. And glucagon is saying, oh, hell, okay. And it releases sugar into an already elevated blood sugar because you're not getting it into your cells because the insulin-glucagon relationship is broken. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And
difficult to understand, but
I want to walk it through a scenario though, because everything that you just said, like, set off light bulbs in my brain, because a little bit about my carnivore journey. When I first got on it, within the first 6 months or so, I mean, I felt phenomenal. Performance in the gym was great. I was getting leaner, moving really close towards that competition shape that I had been in without trying.
right.
And I was like, this is awesome. Fast forward another 4 months, and I'm noticing, I feel like I'm like losing a little bit of muscle now, and I'm eating plenty of protein. My training has not changed.
Well, I would tell you, let me just stop you for a second there. My biggest problem with my athletes is trying to get them to eat less protein rather than more. There is nothing that you can eat on a carnivore diet that doesn't contain protein, and it's always too much. But the narrative out there, and I love some of the folks, I know them well in the space, protein, protein, protein. No, fat, fat, fat. Fat protects protein. But if you're eating too much protein, you're screwing the hormonal system. And then you're doing exactly what I said earlier on. You're making sugar, not muscle. So
I want you to finish your thought, but how much is too much protein for, let's just say, like
I don't know. I don't know. And nobody knows, but I can tell you exactly whether you're right, whether your protein consumption is enough, too little, or your fat ratio based on blood work. So I am heavily influenced by blood work. I look at your BUN, I look at your triglycerides, I look at your uric acid, I look at the numbers, and I can tell you, because everybody's different and everybody's different on a different day.
Right.
But the narrative in the carnivore space is protein, 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 and it should be fat, fat, fat. You will never, ever run a protein deficit on a carnivore diet,
Right.
period.
That I totally believe. I mean, it would be very difficult to do that. And yeah, so just continuing on though, it was very interesting because without doing blood work, I'm noticing certain physiological changes that I recognize are not necessarily moving me in the direction that I want to go. And I added just a tiny bit of carbohydrates back in, usually in the form of maybe a small serving of rice once per week. More recently, it became
the biggest thing when you add back carbohydrates is make sure that the things that come along for the ride are not pro-inflammatory. So I'm very leery of certain plant-based carbohydrates because of the proteins that come along with them. So I'm fine with the source of carbohydrate, but you don't want to be eating grain products that bring along the plant-based protein inflammation. So that's where you just have to be cautious.
And with that being said, more recently it's been a tablespoon of honey in my tea and something like that. And I felt like that gives me just enough of what I need. And like I said, this is without blood work. This is me just recognizing my body function, performance, all of it, as well as, physical appearance. I noticed a difference almost
delicate
immediately.
tightrope there is not to release too much insulin that blocks fat mobilization. You still want fat from your fat cells, but you want a slight elevation in insulin at times when you're eating. So it's a very delicate tightrope. And we can work that out for our patients. A little bit of trial and error, but based on blood work, we can figure that out. Because too much pushes you back the other way.
Exactly.
Because the goal of insulin is to trigger, the goal of the sugar in your diet is not as an energy source, it's as a hormonal trigger. And it depends on where you are as an individual. And we can, again, look at the numbers and see where you are.
No, I mean, that makes perfect sense. And that's why I feel like, you gave me confirmation that I wasn't going crazy, that adding this back in was the right move. And not that I would do a, Paul Saladino and a complete, 360 and suddenly I'm consuming, 300 grams worth of carbohydrates a day.
Let me go there for a second, because what works for Paul if his blood work, and he and I are going to be having a discussion. We've got a podcast coming up together, not an assault on each other, but hey, let's understand who you are and let's find consensus. So Paul talks a lot about himself because that's his narrative, but he's not me and he's not most of my patients. I use some examples from my own life just to bring a point across, but it's not about me. It's about who you are. And you guys are obviously vastly different to me. So I've got to manage you as based on who you are, not try to clone you into me. And I think that's one of the differences I have with Paul. So if you look at a study done by Isabella Cooper, beautiful, probably the best study in the space, where she took a bunch of young premenopausal women, and they had all been fat adapted in ketosis for more than 4 years. And she then put them on the standard UK diet. It's an English study of 267 grams of carbohydrates a day, less than what Paul eats in a day. And she did extensive blood work before, during, and then put them back on the ketogenic diet and showed in every one of them a significant worsening of all their inflammatory blood work and their vascular blood work. They also, what was interesting is they were eating more calories on a carnivore, on a ketogenic diet. They were eating less calories on a carbohydrate diet, and yet they all gained significant weight. But the interesting thing about all of these women, they were all eating around 50 to 75 grams of carbohydrates, up to maybe one or two of them 100 grams of carbohydrates, and yet they were in deep ketosis. Above 75 to 100, they were flipping out of ketosis. So, and they proved that by eating 267. So what works for Paul is not the standard stuff that we're talking about. So you want some carbohydrate, but you don't want to push it too high, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does.
So but that Isabella Cooper paper was excellent in terms of what you're just talking about.
That's great. All right. Well, wow.
We could go for hours more with you. We'll definitely have to have you back on.
Yeah.
So appreciate
fascinating conversation.
Yeah, your wisdom and experience. So obviously we will link to your social in our bio and the show notes. But if someone wanted to work with you as a physician, could they do that?
Yeah, I think first of all, I love what you guys are talking about and doing about it, but everything should be an experiment. It should all be about feedback, and the best feedback you get is not guessing. It is looking at your blood work, because that's absolute data, and then having that interpreted. So that's a large part of what we do. We give some direction, but then we follow the blood work and give guidance over time. And there's no one right answer. It's continuously evolving. You got better, then you got worse because you got healthier, and then you came back a little bit. That's the narrative out there. It's not static. It is evolving all the time as your journey gets better. If people want to set up a visit, I'm kind of fully booked, but we're always available. You may have to wait a little bit. But it's called our bat phone. It's where you can come in by text, by WhatsApp, or by phone call. It is 561-517-0642. And I am a practicing physician in the US, but I see patients from all over the world.
Wonderful.
That's excellent.
That's
We'll definitely
awesome.
put all that in the show notes.
Dr. Cywes, thank you so much
Yes,
for your
thank you.
time, wisdom, research. This was invaluable, and we can't wait to have you back.
Oh, you're welcome. I told you I talk a lot.
Yeah, I love it.
Oh, we love it. We love it. No, this has been
Brilliant.
great. Thank you so much. And everybody, just be sure to check the show notes. Also, we're going to connect to Dr. Cywes, all of his Instagram. He's got an awesome YouTube page as well. So definitely go there and check that out. And we will see you guys again next time.